Now, I appreciate the irony in today's topic, which is all about the power of editing. And I'm saying I appreciate the irony because this format of me sharing is largely unedited. I pretty much just let my thoughts come out, stream of consciousness style, very much a monologue and an insight into the inner workings of my brain without really editing anything except some of the longer pauses to make the whole process more enjoyable for you as a viewer to watch. But I do want to talk about editing today because it's one of the things that I do for my clients. And specifically, I do this inside my signature one-to-one self-study hybrid program, which is called Project Clarity, which is where we clarify your message and understand how you can share it in a way that gets people excited to work with you. But editing is one of the ways that we actually make this happen. But before we get into the nitty-gritty of that, I just wanted to share with you that when I think about creating anything, I really think about it in two phases. And to be honest, there's probably three now that I think about it. The first stage is very much a creative phase. It is where you let everything come out on the page. You don't worry about how it's going to sound. You don't worry about whether it reads perfectly. It's really the act of transforming what's in your brain into pixels. And then the second phase that comes in is this editing phase, which is where with a slightly more discerning and critical hat, we come back to that work and look through it from the eyes of our audience. We look through it from the eyes of the person that we are trying to excite or engage or inspire and see which parts of what we've created serve that purpose. Now, the third phase is actually probably sharing it and marketing and actually hitting publishing on it, which again requires an even more strategic approach, which is where you really think about how to package that act of creation so that it will inspire people to actually click on it and view and engage with the content. But what I want to talk about today is the act of editing and maybe just give you some advice about how you can approach this yourself so that you don't necessarily need someone like me, although I will admit, very good at being that editor role for you, but so that you can start to do this yourself as well. Now, when I'm editing, the first thing that I look for is understanding what the whole point or the whole message that we're trying to convey is with that piece of creation. So what is the thing that we want our viewer to walk away knowing? How do we want their life to have changed, or what level of understanding or thought process do we want to have kicked off in their mind? And I very much recommend that, particularly I'm talking about content creation really here, whether it's long form or short form or whatever it is. I really want you to think about, like, what do I want people, if I showed them this post and I gave them like a couple of minutes to read it and then half an hour later I said to them, hey, what did you take away from that? What do I want them to say? Like, what do I want that response to be? So for example, with this video, I want you to walk away and really have a think about the act of editing and how you approach editing. And maybe the next time you sit down to create, you do give yourself that permission to create freely and then edit ruthlessly. And you might just remember this video when you're doing so. So that's always the first step that I consider. What's the point of this? What do I want people to walk away knowing or feeling after having consumed that piece of content? Because from that point, I can then edit this piece to best serve that purpose. And what I will just say here is that I often only find my points through letting everything come out on the page first. I don't necessarily go into it knowing what my point's going to be. It often just emerges. Now, sometimes I might go in with a bit of a prompt. Like today, I thought, you know what? I'm going to just talk about the act of editing because it's cropped up for me. But actually the points themselves, they're emerging right now as I'm speaking to you. And I think this can happen for me because I'm fairly well practiced at it. But for you, I do want you to, again, remember that when you're writing, let that just happen freely, or creating or filming a video, whatever it is. I talk about writing because it's the most sort of obvious one to think about. But whatever that act of initial creation is, don't stress too much about what the point is. Maybe have something loose in your mind that you're sort of riffing around. But in that act of editing, that's when you can really clarify what the point of this work is and then go through with your red pen or your delete button or your cut and paste things somewhere else, really with that mind of every single part of this, is it contributing to getting that point across, or is it fluff? So that first step is really about tightening the work up and ensuring that it is making the point that I want to make. And yes, this includes getting rid of the parts that don't contribute to that point. And if you feel a bit nervy about deleting some of that work, what you can always do is have at the bottom of the document, you can have like a little divider, and instead of deleting it, you can just grab those sentences and move them out the way so that you know you still have them. You can always come back to them later. You can chuck them in a notes app if you're like, actually, this is a whole separate point and this is going to be great as a post on its own. You can take that and move it elsewhere. But we really want to make sure that this piece of work on its own has a clear reason for existing. Now, the second thing that I do once I've tightened the work up is then go through and look for the opportunity to add in personality. So I look for places where I've maybe used phrases that are a bit boring or conceptual or don't really mean anything, and look for how I can actually inject a little bit of me into the work. So how can I take a conceptual sentences and turn it specific in a way that only I probably would because it's relevant to my life? So to give you a random example, somewhere you might have written something like, oh, it made me feel really nervous. Feeling nervous, that's an emotion. That's a concept, really. When you say feeling nervous, people could picture that 150 different ways. So a way for me to inject some personality into that is instead describe what feeling nervous actually meant to me. So how would I describe how I felt in that moment? How would I describe the feeling of being nervous? So I might say something like, there was a tightness in my stomach and I thought I was going to be sick. Or I might say something like, my mouth was so dry that my tongue kept sticking to the roof of my mouth and I felt like I couldn't get a single word out. Or I could try and inject a bit of humor and say something like, my mouth was so dry it felt like I hadn't had a drink of water in the past 15 years. Obviously that doesn't sound very funny in the moment, but what I want you to take from this is that once you've been through and tightened up your creation, you can then go through and look for those specific parts where maybe they're a bit generic. And actually a great question here is, I like to look at certain aspects of it and think, could anybody have written that? Like, could somebody else take this whole piece of work and read it out and it wouldn't be jarring? Because I want people to come across my work and distinctly understand that it's something I have created. Now, in video format, that's obviously super easy because this is how I speak and that's how it's going to come out, you know? I don't really have to overly think about it, but when we start to actually transfer things into writing or to words on the page, that's where we do want to get a little bit more discerning about how can we make sure that our personality is apparent. Now, the next thing that I recommend in this editing phase is to create some space between you and the work. Now, a couple of caveats here. For me, I know that I overthink. I have a real habit of actually over editing my own work and really falling into traps of perfectionism and things like that. So when I say create space between the work, for some people, that might not be the right step for you. So for me, I know that I tend to actually create it and pretty much try and get it published and out into the world and off my desk as quick as possible. Because the longer it stays, the more likely I am to never hit publish on that thing. That's just my pattern. So when I'm saying create distance, I don't want you to think that that distance is so that you can come back the next day and rewrite the whole thing. But when it comes to me reviewing my clients' work, for example, I will tend to go through and make some edits and step away and then come back and just check it all still makes sense. Because sometimes when we are in a different frame of mind, certain other things can jump out to us, other things can become apparent, and we're like, oh my God, that makes absolutely no sense now. I just need to rewrite that sentence. It's totally fine to do that and a really powerful exercise to create that distance. So don't be afraid of doing something, walking away and coming back to it. But do just keep an eye on yourself if, like me, you do have those tendencies of perfectionism or you have a habit of overly noodling things before you publish them out into the world as well. Just something to keep an eye on. Now, my next piece of advice or tip on editing things is if it is written work, then read it out loud. I'm assuming you've probably heard this advice somewhere else, but how often do you actually do it? But it really helps to understand, how does this piece feel? What's the flow of it? Does this capture my personality, or does this sound dry and boring? When you read things out, it really does allow you to hear your written work in a different way. So although it's a more common tip, or one that you might have heard before, I thoroughly recommend that you do it. And my final tip on editing, which kind of crosses over into that third phase of sort of getting ready to publish, is to actually visually consider your piece. So if it is written text, look at how you can actually format that text, put in spaces, use italics, bolds, underlines, actually design how your text looks to help make it easier to read. And likewise in video format, maybe you've gone through and actually, cut out the bits that are superfluous to the purpose. However, I would also kind of take a pass at it and look and listen and observe it in terms of, what is the pacing like? What is the flow like? Is there any bits where you could do with tightening up the gaps, which is what I do with these videos, just to make it more enjoyable for the viewer and increase your chances of somebody making it the whole way through that piece of content that you have spent all that time creating. Now, if I was more organized, I could totally go through and summarize all those tips for you. But like I said, I don't plan these things. This is just me sharing in the moment, me just sharing what's in my mind. So I actually can't really remember all the tips that I've given you. But hey, this is how I like to create, and this is what works for me. And I'm hoping it works for you as well, because, I talk about this stuff a lot all the time, which is why it's able to come out with such ease, because this isn't the first time that I'm saying any of this stuff. This is what I've been telling my clients for the past 4.5 years. This is what I write about. So yes, it flows quite easily for me in this context. And I've just thought of another tip as well. Make sure you give your work in that editing process, make sure it has a satisfying ending or conclusion, which is probably why I was just drawn to try and summarize things for you, because I wanted to wrap things up neatly. But alas, I cannot, because this is quite simply how I roll. But hey, I'm sure you can go through and take notes and really just take the ideas that resonate with you most. And the next time you sit down to create something, do you spend a little bit of time considering, how are you editing your work separately from the creation process, so that your ideas have the best chance of landing with your audience and getting them excited to continue following your content, engaging with what you do, or reaching out to work with you. That's it for today. Go get creative, take messy action, and most of all, don't forget to have fun with it.